be careful with what seems ordinary today, because one of the most revealing moments may arrive disguised as something completely insignificant. It could happen while you are reading a group conversation, listening to someone speak, during a meeting exchanging a few casual words, or simply sitting across from a familiar person and suddenly realizing that the relationship feels different when you stop making excuses for what you have already noticed. Perhaps there is a message that you read once, then return to because something about it feels different the second time. Perhaps someone says something in a shared space that you would normally explain away, soften, or interpret in the most generous possible way. Yet today your mind refuses to smooth over what is actually being communicated. Or maybe nothing dramatic is said at all. Maybe the realization comes from watching who speaks, who remains silent, whose opinion automatically receives attention, and whose presence is quietly overlooked. Today is August 25th, 2026, and the moon has entered Aquarius, where it is moving into conjunction with Pluto, a planet that has been traveling through Aquarius for years and steadily bringing hidden collective and personal patterns toward transformation. When the moon makes contact with Pluto today, the slow process of revelation becomes something much more immediate and emotionally tangible. What you have managed to place in the background can suddenly move directly into your awareness. This combination can expose old patterns involving influence, belonging, authority, social roles, and the question of who truly has a voice inside a group. For 5 signs, this energy is especially direct, and what emerges may help them begin releasing something they have been carrying for much longer than this single day. If something already became obvious to you this morning, pay attention to that experience rather than dismissing it as coincidence. At the same time, there is an important truth about this transit that deserves to be acknowledged before going any further. Clarity does not always feel good when it first arrives. Pluto is not known for revealing things in a way that allows you to remain completely comfortable, and because Aquarius deals so strongly with communities, networks, friendships, and collective environments, the realization may involve another person or an entire group rather than something you can quietly process in isolation. If today's truth creates tension, disappointment, vulnerability, or even a strange sense of emotional pressure, that does not automatically mean the transit is working against you. Sometimes discomfort is simply what happens when awareness finally catches up with reality. The reason this can feel so intense becomes clearer when you understand what each part of the transit contributes. The moon represents the emotional habits you fall into almost automatically, the reactions and patterns that can become so familiar that you stop questioning where they came from. Pluto represents profound transformation, the kind that reaches beneath the surface and forces something hidden to become visible enough that it can no longer continue operating unnoticed. Aquarius brings the focus toward communities, social structures, belonging, collective relationships, and the invisible rules that determine who receives influence and who is expected to adapt. When these energies meet, the question becomes deeply personal. Where have you accepted an imbalance inside a group because speaking honestly about it seemed more dangerous, inconvenient, or emotionally exhausting than simply living with it? Think about the ancient symbolism associated with Pluto. In mythology, Pluto ruled the underworld, a realm beneath ordinary consciousness where what had been hidden eventually had to be encountered. This was not simply a place of punishment. It represented everything that exists beneath the visible surface, including truths people avoid, grief that remains unresolved, motives that are never spoken aloud, and realities that cannot remain concealed forever. That is why Pluto's transformative symbolism is so powerful. It does not merely point towards something hidden. It brings that hidden material into a state where it can finally be recognized for what it is. And Pluto works on a scale that is far larger than one emotional moment. Pluto entered Aquarius in 2023 and is expected to remain there until roughly 2044. That means this is part of a generational process, one capable of influencing entire eras rather than producing changes that disappear after a few months. During this long passage, broader structures connected with technology, collective belonging, and the distribution of power are gradually being questioned, exposed, and transformed. These developments can be so gradual that they are difficult to recognize while living through them. Yet the pattern becomes much clearer when you look backward across several years. Today's Moon-Pluto conjunction gives you a brief personal experience of that much larger process. Something happening inside your own relationships or community can become a small reflection of the broader transformation Pluto is already moving through Aquarius. For the next several hours, as the moon passes through Aquarius and touches Pluto's deeper symbolic territory, the focus turns toward the collective spaces you participate in every day. A social imbalance that has existed for a long time does not suddenly have to be created today. Instead, your ability to overlook it becomes weaker. Imagine a circle of friends where one person repeatedly dominates every conversation. Imagine a family group conversation where certain voices are automatically treated as more important than others. Imagine a workplace where recognition repeatedly goes to the same people, while someone else contributes just as much and receives far less acknowledgement. These patterns may have existed for months or even years. Today does not necessarily manufacture them. It can simply remove the emotional filter that previously allowed you to keep looking away. For Aries, this becomes especially personal because the Moon and Pluto are activating the area of friendships and community. You may find yourself observing a social environment with an honesty you have not been willing to access before. Perhaps you have sensed for some time that the balance within a particular group was not what it appeared to be. Yet you kept moving forward because acknowledging it would have required you to reconsider your place within that community. Today, that avoidance becomes harder to maintain. You may suddenly recognize who has influence, who receives attention, who is repeatedly interrupted, and who has learned to remain quiet because they already understand that their words will not receive the same consideration. The important part for Aries is not that you immediately confront everyone involved. The deeper movement begins internally, with the moment you stop arguing with your own perception. You may feel an instinct to act quickly because direct action is usually more comfortable for you than sitting with uncertainty, but today's energy asks for something different first. Observe. Let the entire pattern reveal itself. Allow yourself to understand what is actually happening before deciding what deserves a response. The realization itself may be the most valuable part of today's experience. And remember, not every truth that comes to the surface demands a dramatic correction. Sometimes information is valuable simply because it changes the way you make decisions. You may discover that a certain community no longer reflects who you are, and the wisest response may not be a confrontation at all. It may simply be creating more distance, becoming less available, or quietly choosing different people and spaces in the future. Some revelations are instructions to repair something. Others are instructions to stop investing in something that no longer fits. For Taurus, the same Moon-Pluto energy moves into the territory of public reputation and long-range ambitions, making today's realization more connected to the identity you have created in professional or visible spaces. You may begin questioning a role you have been playing for the benefit of an audience, organization, professional circle, or community, whose approval once seemed necessary. Perhaps you have learned to present yourself in a certain way because it keeps expectations predictable and acceptance easier to maintain. Perhaps you have said what others wanted to hear, adjusted your position to match the room, or restrained an honest opinion because belonging felt safer than standing apart. Today can place that compromise under a much stronger light. The deeper question is not simply whether people approve of you, it is whether the version of yourself they approve of is actually the version you want to continue carrying. Try removing the imagined reaction of the audience from the equation. Picture yourself holding the same professional position, expressing the same public opinion, or pursuing the same long-term goal. But imagine that nobody around you could approve or disapprove of it. Would you still recognize that choice as yours? Would it still feel natural when there was no applause to receive and no criticism to avoid? Or would you suddenly notice how much of it was built around maintaining acceptance? That realization can be uncomfortable because performance often develops slowly. You may not have consciously decided to become someone else. You may simply have adapted one small time after another until the adapted version began to feel normal. So if today's awareness brings emotional resistance, do not immediately judge yourself for having reached this point. There may have been very real reasons why approval once felt necessary. The important shift is recognizing what that strategy has protected you from and what it may have prevented you from expressing. Today's clarity can therefore become a quiet turning point, not because you must make an immediate public declaration, but because you can begin distinguishing between what genuinely represents you and what you have maintained primarily to remain accepted. And as that distinction becomes clearer, the next layer of today's transit begins to reveal why this moment can carry much more weight than it first appears. Recognizing that you have been performing a version of yourself for the sake of belonging can create another trap if you immediately turn that realization into a reason to criticize yourself. You may look backward and wonder how you could have continued the pattern for so long, why you did not recognize it sooner, or why you kept adapting when some part of you already knew the adaptation was costing you something. But that reaction misses an important part of the story. You did not create the pattern for no reason. At some point, it protected something important. Maybe it helped you avoid rejection. Maybe it allowed you to remain accepted inside a community that mattered deeply to you. Maybe there was a period in your life when expressing exactly what you felt or believed could have created consequences you were not prepared to handle. A strategy that once protected your place in a group can become deeply automatic because the mind learns from what keeps it safe. That is why today's realization should not be used as evidence that you somehow failed yourself. The more useful question is much simpler and much more powerful. Does this behavior still have a real purpose in your life now? The circumstances that created it may have changed. The people around you may have changed. Your position within the group may have changed. Even you may have changed considerably since the moment the pattern first became necessary. What once functioned as protection can eventually become routine, continuing not because danger remains, but because your nervous system remembers what it once needed to do. This is where today's energy becomes a genuine turning point. You are not being asked to condemn the person who learned how to survive within an old environment. You are being invited to recognize that the same strategy may no longer deserve automatic control over your present choices. Leo experiences this tension through the direct opposition between individual identity and collective expectation, because Leo stands across from Aquarius in the zodiac, while Aries and Taurus may be more focused on recognizing patterns within the behavior and structures around them. Your realization is more likely to turn the mirror inward. You may suddenly notice how often you have edited yourself before entering a group space, softened your personality, reduced your opinions, withheld your enthusiasm, or made yourself easier to accommodate because some part of you believed that belonging required a smaller version of who you really are. The important realization for Leo is that the community itself may never have demanded this sacrifice. You may have been responding to an expectation that existed primarily inside your own memory. Somewhere earlier in your story, there may have been a group where being fully expressive was genuinely uncomfortable or unwelcome. Perhaps you learned that showing too much confidence attracted criticism, speaking too honestly created tension, or taking up emotional or social space made acceptance feel uncertain. So you adjusted. You became quieter in certain environments. You watched before speaking. You offered only the parts of yourself that seemed safest to display. At that time, this was not weakness, it was adaptation. The problem is that adaptation does not automatically disappear when the original threat disappears. You can carry an old survival response into a completely different room and continue behaving as though the old rules still apply. Today's clarity asks Leo to examine that possibility without exaggerating it. Look at the community you are part of now. Does it genuinely require you to make yourself smaller, or have you continued making yourself smaller because an earlier experience taught you that this was the safest way to belong? There is a profound difference between those two realities, and today's transit can help you see which one you are actually living. Scorpio receives this energy differently because Pluto rules Scorpio directly, giving this conjunction a particularly deep emotional quality for you. The revelation may not arrive through an obvious external event. It may emerge as an internal confrontation with a pattern you have repeated for years. You may recognize something about trust, vulnerability, or the amount of your real emotional world you allow other people within a community to access. Scorpio often understands that emotional exposure carries consequences, so you may naturally become selective about what you reveal, even around people you care about. There can be layers of yourself that remain protected behind carefully chosen information, controlled reactions, and measured vulnerability. That instinct did not appear without a history. There may have been experiences that taught you the importance of keeping certain parts of yourself protected. Today's question is therefore not whether you should suddenly trust everyone. That would completely misunderstand the lesson. The question is whether your protective boundaries have expanded so far that they now keep out people who have already demonstrated that they can handle the real you. There is a point where protection can quietly become isolation. The wall that once prevented harm can eventually prevent intimacy too. You might have people around you who have earned more trust than you realize, yet they continue receiving only the carefully edited version of you because your internal rules never received an update. This is delicate territory for Scorpio because discernment is valuable and today's energy is not asking you to throw that discernment away. Instead, it asks you to become more precise with it. Not everyone deserves unrestricted access to you, but perhaps someone in your current community has already shown enough consistency, loyalty, or understanding to deserve one additional layer of honesty. Consider whether there is one relationship where revealing slightly more of your genuine thoughts, feelings, or personality could create connection rather than danger. You do not need to expose everything. You simply need to notice whether your defenses are still responding to present reality or to an older memory. Capricorn encounters the conjunction through a different kind of continuation because the moon has only just moved away from your sign and into Aquarius to meet Pluto. That means the emotional atmosphere surrounding you is shifting directly out of a space that was personally centered on you and into questions involving authority, structure, and collective power. Today may make the hierarchy inside a group, organization, or community suddenly easier to understand. You could become aware of the difference between someone who genuinely possesses earned authority and someone who simply occupies a position that others have become accustomed to respecting. This distinction matters for Capricorn because your relationship with structure can be deeply ingrained. You understand responsibility, hierarchy, competence, and the value of systems, but sometimes familiarity itself can begin to resemble legitimacy. A person may appear powerful because everyone has always treated them as powerful. A role may continue receiving respect because nobody has paused long enough to question whether the person holding it still deserves that respect. Today's energy can interrupt that automatic assumption. You may realize that some authority you have accepted has been sustained less by actual competence or integrity and more by the accumulated habit of everyone continuing to defer. That does not necessarily mean you need to challenge anyone immediately. The first movement is recognition. See what is actually there. Notice who creates real stability and who simply benefits from the appearance of authority. Notice who earns influence through consistency and who receives it because nobody has questioned the arrangement. If your zodiac sign was not included among the 5 receiving the strongest direct emphasis, this does not mean the Moon-Pluto conjunction passes over you. The same underlying theme can appear through another area of your personal chart and through the communities that matter within your own life. Pay attention to smaller moments that carry the same message. You may notice a familiar belonging pattern becoming obvious, recognize an imbalance of influence, or suddenly understand why a particular social environment has felt uncomfortable even when you could not previously explain the reason. Gemini may find increased awareness around communication inside groups, especially regarding whether you tend to reveal too much or deliberately hold too much back depending on who is listening. Cancer may become more aware of emotional caretaking within a family or close community, particularly where responsibility for other people's feelings has become unevenly distributed. Virgo may examine a workplace team or collaborative project and begin questioning whether effort and recognition are being shared fairly. Libra may see partnership dynamics more clearly when those relationships extend into mutual social circles. Sagittarius may question whether a belief system or philosophical community still represents genuine belonging, or whether familiarity alone has kept you attached to it. Pisces may become especially receptive to the emotional atmosphere surrounding a group and notice collective patterns that you were not consciously searching for. Aquarius receives the moon directly through your own sign, so the experience can feel unusually immediate and personal. What appears today may not feel like distant observation. It may feel like something has been placed directly in front of you, making avoidance much harder. But recognition is only the beginning. An old pattern does not truly change simply because you can describe it accurately. Pluto asks for transformation, which means the most meaningful response to today's awareness is likely to involve some real adjustment in how you behave, even if that adjustment is extremely small. You may speak when you would normally remain silent. You may stop automatically agreeing. You may allow yourself to occupy the amount of emotional or social space that is actually appropriate rather than immediately reducing yourself. You may question an authority you previously accepted without examination. The shift does not have to be dramatic to be real. What matters is that your behavior begins reflecting the awareness you have gained. There is also a psychological reason these patterns can remain hidden inside groups for surprisingly long periods, even among people who are highly self-aware in other areas of life. Psychology describes a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, in which many members of a group privately question a particular norm or dynamic, while each person assumes that everyone else accepts it. Because nobody openly objects, each individual interprets the silence as agreement. The result is a powerful feedback loop. One person remains quiet because they believe everyone else supports the situation. Another person stays quiet for exactly the same reason. Eventually, the entire group continues participating in a pattern that very few people actually feel comfortable with. Today's Moon-Pluto conjunction can challenge that silence, because Pluto exposes what remains hidden, while Aquarius directs attention toward the collective environment itself. You may discover that something you thought was only bothering you is actually affecting other people too. That realization can be deeply liberating because private discomfort can feel like a personal flaw, while shared recognition reveals that the problem may exist within the structure of the group itself. Consider an ordinary workplace where everyone privately dislikes a recurring meeting, but nobody suggests changing it. Each person assumes they are the only one frustrated, so the meeting continues simply because everyone mistakes silence for agreement. The same mechanism can exist in friendships, families, organizations, and communities. Today can make that invisible agreement easier to recognize, and once the silence becomes visible, the next question is no longer whether the pattern exists, but what happens when someone finally becomes willing to acknowledge it. What looks like an insignificant social moment can sometimes reveal a pattern that has been operating quietly for years. Imagine a circle of friends where a certain joke has gradually stopped being harmless for several people. Yet everyone keeps laughing because nobody wants to become the person who interrupts the atmosphere and risks appearing overly sensitive or alone in their objection. Think about a family ritual that no longer feels warm or meaningful to most of the people participating, but continues year after year because challenging it seems more uncomfortable than simply tolerating it for another season. These situations may appear ordinary, but they demonstrate exactly how collective silence can keep an outdated pattern alive. So something you notice today resembles one of these examples. Do not automatically assume that your reaction exists in isolation. There is a real possibility that other people have noticed the same thing and simply have not known how to name it. Yet there is another distinction you need to make before deciding what today's realization means. Not every powerful emotion is automatically a new truth. Sometimes a transit can illuminate something that has genuinely been hidden. And sometimes the intensity of the moment can activate an older wound that has been waiting for an opportunity to express itself. Genuine clarity usually has a different emotional texture beneath the surface. Even when the realization is important or painful, there is often a quiet quality to it, almost like something inside you finally settling into place because the explanation suddenly makes sense. Reactivity feels different. It can arrive like an emotional surge, making one person, one comment, or one situation suddenly seem unbearable beyond what the actual circumstances of the day would reasonably explain. If you find yourself experiencing an enormous reaction to something relatively small, pause before deciding that the intensity itself proves you have discovered the truth. Ask whether today's Moon-Pluto energy is revealing a previously unseen pattern, or whether it has simply created enough emotional pressure for an older frustration to attach itself to whatever person or event happened to be available. This matters because the appropriate response changes depending on what you are experiencing. When genuine clarity arrives, it deserves a response that matches the truth you have recognized, but that response does not have to be immediate or dramatic. You can move carefully, you can observe more, you can take one measured step, rather than attempting to transform an entire relationship in a single conversation. If what you are feeling is actually old emotional material being activated, then the wiser response may be internal processing rather than confrontation. You might write about it, sit quietly with it, or acknowledge the older disappointment directly so that you do not place years of accumulated emotional weight onto today's temporary trigger. Neither experience makes you wrong. The important thing is learning to distinguish revelation from emotional displacement, because that distinction gives you much more control over what happens next. And if you recognize yourself in one of the 5 signs already discussed, or even if your sign is not among them but today's broader theme has clearly touched something personal, bring the question down to one practical point. What is the smallest action you can take today that honestly respects what you have just understood? Not the ultimate confrontation, not the complete repair of a friendship, family structure, workplace, or community. Just one sincere movement that aligns your behavior with the awareness you now have. That small movement matters because today's realization does not exist in isolation from the larger astrological timing. In 2 days, on the 27th, the lunar eclipse in Pisces arrives, bringing the close of an 18-month cycle and what many astrologers describe as one of the month's deepest periods of emotional catharsis. Today's moon in Aquarius, meeting Pluto's long-term process of exposure, can therefore be understood as an immediate preparation for that larger release. It brings buried material toward awareness through the specific themes of community, belonging, influence, and power, giving you a chance to recognize what needs attention before the eclipse reaches its own emotional threshold. The timing is meaningful. Astrologers have long observed that major eclipse periods often begin announcing themselves well before the exact astronomical event, with the days leading toward an eclipse frequently carrying a growing sense that something is approaching, something is becoming impossible to ignore, or something previously contained is moving toward release. What you're experiencing today can be understood through that same principle, but in a more concentrated form. The eclipse is getting closer, and its influence can feel increasingly noticeable rather than remaining perfectly steady throughout the entire lead-up period. If yesterday's atmosphere felt like a quiet build-up, today's Moon-Pluto conjunction can feel much more focused, almost like a preview that shows you the specific subject the larger eclipse process may soon ask you to confront. So if an old pattern became visible today, especially one involving a community, a family, a friendship circle, or an imbalance around influence and authority, do not dismiss that realization simply because the event itself seemed small. It may be connected to what the eclipse is preparing to help you release on Thursday. Today can represent recognition. Thursday can represent a deeper movement toward letting go. There is an especially meaningful connection if the pattern that surfaced involves family. The Omega Institute and other astrological sources have specifically described this eclipse as supportive of healing fractures within family structures and bringing suppressed truths into awareness. That makes today's family-related revelations particularly relevant. Family systems can contain deeply established rules about whose opinion matters, whose emotions receive attention, who is allowed to make decisions, who becomes responsible for maintaining peace, and who is expected to remain silent. These patterns often existed before the current generation consciously chose them. A present-day family conversation or group message can therefore activate something much older than the immediate event appears to suggest. A reaction that seems connected to today's words may actually be connected to decades of accumulated family expectations. If you recognize that depth today, give yourself permission to move slowly. Seeing a long-standing family pattern does not mean you must completely dismantle the entire system before Thursday. Awareness is already a meaningful development. You have moved from participating in something automatically to seeing it consciously, and that difference matters. Generational patterns deserve particular patience because they were often created by people responding to circumstances that no longer exist. A survival strategy developed by a grandparent during a difficult period can gradually become a family rule repeated by children and grandchildren who never personally experienced the original circumstances. Eventually, nobody remembers why the behavior began. They simply know that this is how the family does things. If today's realization reaches back into territory like that, curiosity will serve you better than blame. Someone in an earlier generation may have adopted the pattern for understandable reasons given what they were facing at the time. The fact that the pattern made sense then does not mean it must remain permanent now. That is where your freedom begins. The people who originally established the pattern may never have had the distance, safety, or awareness necessary to question it. You may have that opportunity now. You can recognize where it came from without automatically continuing it. Before Thursday's eclipse arrives, there is one simple practice that can help you understand what today's revelation is really showing you. Write down the pattern you noticed in plain language. Then write one honest sentence describing how long you believe you have been carrying it. You do not need to know the exact beginning. An approximate sense of its age is enough. Patterns rarely announce their history when they are happening because repetition makes them feel normal. But when you deliberately ask how long this has been part of your life, you may realize that what felt like a sudden discovery today has actually been developing quietly for years. That realization can change the way you understand the entire situation. There is also another planetary influence supporting the practical side of today's process. Mercury entered Virgo today, bringing a more precise and grounded quality to communication, while the Moon-Pluto conjunction is exposing emotionally significant material. This becomes particularly useful if the awareness you gain today eventually needs to become a conversation. Pluto may show you what has been buried, but seeing the truth and communicating the truth are not the same skill. Mercury and Virgo can help you put specific language around what you have noticed, allowing you to describe a behavior, a pattern, or a need with greater precision, instead of speaking from an undefined emotional reaction. You may not need to have that conversation today. The value is knowing that the language can become clearer as the emotional intensity settles. This combination creates a useful balance between depth and practicality. Pluto brings the hidden material upward. Mercury in Virgo helps organize what has surfaced into something understandable and actionable. That connection fits the broader rhythm of this week because Virgo season began 3 days ago and has emphasized the process of turning internal realization into something concrete. What happens inside you does not have to remain abstract. It can eventually become a boundary, a sentence, a decision, a different response, or a clearer understanding of where you belong. Today's energy continues that movement, taking the emotional revelations of Pluto and giving them a more practical path toward expression, especially when the truth involves the complicated territory of community, belonging, and collective patterns. And as this week moves closer to the eclipse, what you are beginning to see today may become much harder to ignore. If today's message connected with something you are actually living through, tell me in the comments which of the 5 signs felt most closely connected to your experience and what pattern became impossible for you to overlook. I genuinely want to know what became visible in your world because these personal experiences often reveal how the same transit can express itself through completely different circumstances, relationships, and emotional histories. One person may recognize a power imbalance inside a friendship group. Another may notice an old family expectation, while someone else may suddenly understand why a professional environment has felt uncomfortable for so long. Reading those different experiences together can reveal the broader pattern moving underneath today's astrology. If you find value in having these transits explained through the actual sequence of the week, rather than discovering their meaning only after the experience has already happened, subscribe so you can follow the deeper development of Thursday's eclipse as it arrives. If today's message describes something you have genuinely been noticing, leave a like and consider sharing it with someone who may be experiencing a similar realization, but has not yet found the words to describe what they are feeling. Thank you for staying with me through this reflection. There are 2 days remaining until the eclipse, and we are moving toward it together. Whatever you discovered today does not need to be completely solved before the day ends. You do not need to immediately confront every person involved, repair every relationship, or redesign every community that suddenly looks different to you. The most difficult movement may already have happened because you were willing to look directly at something you had previously made easier to ignore. That willingness to see without immediately defending, explaining, minimizing, or blaming is where meaningful transformation begins. Action can come later. Understanding can deepen over time. But without honest recognition, the old pattern continues operating automatically. There is a larger truth underneath today's experience that is worth carrying with you. Patterns inside groups can survive for remarkably long periods, not necessarily because nobody notices them, but because noticing something that everyone else has quietly agreed not to discuss requires courage. A person may sense the imbalance. Another person may feel uncomfortable with the tradition. Someone else may recognize that the same individual always receives more influence. Yet each person assumes they are alone in noticing it, so silence continues to protect the pattern. Today's transit briefly created an easier doorway into that awareness. The moon moving through Aquarius and meeting Pluto gave personal emotional attention to the kinds of collective dynamics that can otherwise remain invisible through ordinary routine. What became visible today may therefore be more significant than it first appears. You do not have to know exactly what you will do with it yet. The fact that you can now see the pattern more clearly already represents movement toward the deeper transformation Pluto has been developing through Aquarius across the collective for years. A long generational process suddenly became personal enough for you to feel it inside an ordinary conversation, a familiar group, or a relationship you have been navigating for a long time. Whatever the pattern has been costing you, whether that cost has appeared as emotional exhaustion, reduced authenticity, distance from other people, or the constant effort of adapting yourself to maintain peace, today's awareness can mark the beginning of a different relationship with that pattern. Do not expect an old behavior to disappear simply because you have finally identified it. Recognition does not instantly erase conditioning. It gives you the possibility of choosing differently the next time the pattern appears. That is why today matters. For the 5 signs most directly involved, and potentially for many others experiencing the same theme through different parts of their charts, an important first movement has taken place. You have seen something that previously operated beneath conscious attention. Now imagine the version of yourself that no longer carries that same burden. Imagine entering the same community without automatically shrinking, remaining silent, performing, overprotecting, or accepting an imbalance simply because it has become familiar. Imagine being able to participate without carrying the invisible weight that today's realization has revealed. That version of you is not some impossible future identity. It can emerge gradually, through the choices that follow awareness. One honest decision may lead to another. One changed response may eventually weaken a pattern that once felt permanent. One boundary, one conversation, one moment of authenticity can begin changing the relationship you have with the entire dynamic. There is no requirement that transformation happen on a dramatic timetable. Genuine change can take days or weeks, depending on how long the pattern has existed and how deeply it has been woven into your relationships. There is also an encouraging possibility that is easy to overlook when you are afraid of what will happen after a hidden pattern is finally named. Sometimes the moment one person speaks honestly is the moment everyone else realizes they were never alone in feeling the same thing. This is where the psychological phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance can finally begin to break. People who have privately questioned the same situation may actually feel relieved when someone finally gives language to what they have also experienced. You may imagine that naming a difficult dynamic will automatically create conflict, embarrassment, or rejection, yet in many situations the reaction is more supportive than the anxious mind predicts. Someone may respond with relief. Another person may admit that they noticed it too. Someone else may finally feel safe enough to describe their own experience. This does not happen every time, and some environments will resist uncomfortable truths when those truths threaten an established structure. But the possibility of shared recognition is important to remember before assuming that silence from others means agreement. As you decide whether and when to respond to whatever became clear today, allow yourself to leave room for that possibility without forcing it. You do not have to predict the outcome before taking the first honest step. And as tomorrow arrives and the following day brings you closer to the eclipse, remember that this entire 18-month eclipse cycle is approaching its genuine conclusion on Thursday. Today's awareness has a place within that larger process. Whether the pattern you recognized feels enormous or almost painfully ordinary, it still contributes something to the emotional work leading toward that closing point. Every honest realization gathered during these final days can prepare the ground for the deeper release the eclipse may bring. There is a reason this particular sequence has felt unusually concentrated. Sunday's Jupiter-Saturn trine, yesterday's Mercury shift into Virgo, today's Moon-Pluto conjunction, and Thursday's closing eclipse create a continuous chain of astrological movement in which each day carries its own distinct emphasis while contributing to the larger unfolding story. Across an entire year, there are relatively few stretches that feel this continuously active and trackable. One development leads into another, creating a sense that the atmosphere is evolving rather than remaining static. If you have been paying attention throughout this sequence, you may have noticed something changing not only in the events around you, but also in the way you observe yourself moving through them. You may be becoming more sensitive to patterns that previously passed beneath your attention. You may notice the difference between intuition and emotional reaction more quickly. You may recognize when you are adapting out of genuine choice, and when you are adapting simply because an old habit is still operating. That growing ability to observe what is actually happening within you and around you may be more valuable than any single forecast connected to any one day. Astrology can point toward a particular moment, but the deepest skill is learning how to remain awake while the moment unfolds. Today place the spotlight on community, belonging, influence, and hidden group patterns. The days ahead will bring their own questions, and the same awareness you have been practicing throughout this week can help you meet whatever comes next without returning automatically to old ways of seeing. The eclipse is approaching, but today's work was never only about Thursday. It was about developing the courage to recognize reality while it is happening and carrying that awareness forward into whatever comes next.